Hello and welcome to Ace the English Hub. We already discussed the history and religion of the Old English period. Coming to the literature of the period, the first point to remember is that literature did not always exist in the form of printed books. Literature is a living thing and it was distributed in many ways. The oldest way is by one person repeating a poem or other literary composition to others and being passed on by generations. However, the earliest kind of composition in all languages is in the form of verse. Anglo Saxon literature is the earliest form of English literature. This literature consists of both what the Anglo Saxons brought over with them from their continental homes and what they composed after settling down in Britain. The former was chiefly verse and belonged to the oral tradition passed down by word of mouth from generation to generation. This literature is anonymous. It achieved a written form long after its composition when the Anglo Saxons had been converted to Christianity. Coming to Old English poetry. In Anglo Saxon or Old English literature too, poetry was the earliest kind of composition. The first poets were the gleemen or the wandering minstrels who traveled from place to place and sang in the great halls of kings on festive occasions or in gatherings of men sitting around the fire on long winter evenings. The themes of the earliest English poetry were legends and tales of warriors, quite like the warlike character of the Anglo Saxons. These poems were filled with a love for war and adventure. They are heroic poems which enshrine the heroic values of a warrior society. They speak of a heroic and pagan society that valued qualities like courage, strength, loyalty, and honor. With the advent of Christianity, Christian elements also crept into their poetry. The poetry of the Old English period exhibited a fusion of paganism and Christianity. The verse written by our Anglo Saxon writers was very different from the language that we have now. The Old English writers used a kind of rhyme called head rhyme or alliteration, while from the 14th century onwards, the poets have always employed end rhyme in their verses. Metaphorical phrases were common, such as war adder for arrow, war shirts for armor, whale's path or swan road for the sea, wave horse for a ship, tree right for a carpenter, etc. The Anglo Saxons were fond of stories. They often gathered around the fire to listen to tales of battle. The most famous of the songs by the wandering minstrels is Beowulf. It is the oldest, the most important, and perhaps the longest poem in Old English, and it is the first major poem in a European vernacular. It is a collection of pagan tales and historical events containing 3,182 lines. It was not composed in England but brought from Europe by the Anglo Saxons. It is historically important as it throws light on the Scandinavian Germanic origins of the English language. Beowulf is a warrior's story. The poem tells the story of a young Beowulf. Beowulf is Geatish. The Geatish is a North Germanic tribe who inhabited Scotland in modern southern Sweden during the Middle Ages. The hero fights and kills a monster, a half devil, half man, Grendel, a monster who attacked Heorot, the hall of the Danish king Hrothgar. Grendel had for long been raiding the banqueting hall of King Hrothgar of Jutland and carrying off and devouring Hrothgar's warriors. Beowulf, a young warrior, goes to the king's aid. He defeats Grendel and later fights with Grendel's mother, a terrifying sea monster. In the second part of the poem, Beowulf is king of the Geats, and as an old man, he defends his country from a fiery dragon that attacked his people. The poem closes with his funeral rites. Wiglaf, one of Beowulf's loyal men who assisted Beowulf in killing the dragon, becomes his successor and the Geats' king. Along with the story, the poem also portrays a picture of society at the court of a warrior, the courtesies, the beer drinking, and the exchanges of gifts. The poet is present among the warriors, chanting his verses of the deeds of warriors. It is not a Christian poem, though it has a Christian flavor given to it by the monastery scribe. For example, Grendel is one of the accursed race of the first murdered Cain from the Bible. Like all Anglo Saxon poems, it is written with a long line. The lines do not rhyme, but each line has alliteration. Nothing in Old English literature can be compared with Beowulf. It has the size and dignity of a classical epic. An animated film, Beowulf, loosely based on the poem, appeared in 2007. Apart from Beowulf, other poems that speak of the pagan heroic past include Widsith, Dio, and Waldair. A number of shorter poems survive, which also belong to the stories of the Germanic people. These include The Wife's Lament, The Husband's Message, The Ruin, The Wanderer, and The Seafarer. An elegiac strain runs through these poems. Life as portrayed in them is sorrowful, and the speakers are fatalistic, though at the same time courageous and determined to endure. There is a larger group of poems on Christian themes. The religious poetry uses the same verse and vocabulary as the pagan poems. Two names associated with this Christian poetry are Cadman and Kinniewulf. The first English poet known by name was Cadman. He was a cowherd employed by the monastery of Whitby. Venerable Bede, in his work Ecclesiastical History of the English People, describes Cadman as a herdsman who received the power of song in a vision. Cadman is supposed to have turned stories from the Bible into English verse, but only a few fragments of his work survive. The only known poem from Cadman's works is Hymn. This poem is known from 21 manuscript copies. Another poet of the time was Kinniewulf. He was probably a Northumbrian or Mercian poet of perhaps the 9th or the 10th century. He is attributed as the creator of 4 poems in runes preserved in Exeter Cathedral Library. His poems Eilean and The Fates of the Apostles are found in the Versailles Book, an Old English manuscript written in the late 10th century. Eilean is a poem of 1321 lines with an account of the finding of the true cross by Saint Helena, the mother of the Roman Emperor Constantine. The Fates of the Apostles, written in 122 lines, describes the mission and death of each of the 12 apostles. The Ascension and Juliana, another 2 poems by Kinniewulf, are in the Exeter Book, a collection of Old English poetry. The Ascension is also titled Christ the Second. It opens with Christ on earth and then dwells on the ascension of Christ to teach the way to salvation, to the last judgment. Juliana tells the life of a virgin martyr. The Dream of the Rood is Kinniewulf's masterpiece. It is considered the earliest dream poem and one of the finest religious poems in the English language. In the poem, the unknown poet sees a dream where he beholds a beautiful tree, the rood or the cross on which Christ died. The rood tells the poet its own story. It describes how it suffered the wounds and insults along with Christ, making himself an instrument to fulfill God's will, becoming a sign of mankind's redemption. Anglo Saxon poetry flourished mostly in the north. Prose developed later in the south. The greatest figure in prose is Bede, also known as the Venerable Bede, an English monk. We owe our knowledge of the Anglo Saxon period mainly because of his work, Ecclesiastical History of the English People. He was an influential scholar and prolific writer, a diligent teacher and scholar of Latin and Greek. He spent nearly all his life in intense study at the monastery of Jarrow. His story of events in his most important work, Ecclesiastical History of the English People, has been proved generally correct by archaeological evidence. The work contains the story of Britain for 8 centuries following the conquest of Britain by Julius Caesar. He has also written nearly 40 works, including treatises, biblical commentaries, and homilies. His other influential work of history is The Lives of the Abbots. This work gives an account of the earlier abbots in Northumbria. Bede wrote in Latin and enjoyed European reputation. His books covered the whole field of human knowledge in his day, and they were also widely copied as textbooks in nearly all monastery schools of Europe. King Alfred the Great was a great patron of literature and lover of learning. He had many books translated into English for the benefit of his subjects. Among them were Bede's Ecclesiastical History of the English People, History of the World by Orosius, Consolation of Philosophy by Boethius, and Pope Gregory's Pastoral Care. Alfred also conceived the idea of a national history and inspired the writing of the Anglo Saxon Chronicle. The Anglo Saxon Chronicle is a chronological account of events in Anglo Saxon England. It is a compilation of 7 surviving interrelated manuscript records. It is the primary source for the early history of England, which was continued till the year 1154. Anglo-Saxon literature in the 10th century was enriched by a direct contribution of the Church. These were the homilies. They are ecclesiastical and educational writings. 2 names are mainly associated with the homilies. Ælfric, a monk at the Benedictine monastery of Winchester, and Wulfstan, a bishop of London and Archbishop of York. Ælfric is best known for his Catholic homilies and Lives of the Saints. We have seen the major works and writers in English during the Anglo-Saxon period. We'll move on to the Middle English period in our next video. Like, share, and subscribe if you find our content useful. Thank you.